Comenzamos ahora este quinto Foro Global de Energía con nuestro primer expositor. Déjenme unos segundos para presentarme. Soy Josefina Townsend, periodista peruana. Para mí es un gusto y es un honor participar en un debate de un tema que es clave, que es crucial para el desarrollo sostenible. Nuestra primera conferencia se llama La transición energética, retos y oportunidades. Invitamos ahora al escenario a que nos acompañe aquí al señor director de la Florence School of Regulation, Jean-Michel Glanchant. Señor Glanchant, por favor, adelante. Bienvenido. Bonjour.
Señoras y señores, buenos días. I did speak Spanish 35 years ago, but I'm afraid I cannot do it anymore. But I'm extremely happy being in Peru and Lima for the very first time. I'm very happy of speaking to your conference, and we did start discussing yesterday. And it's an honor to be in front of you today. I will do my best. As you see, as I am European, I am a professor. I will do my best to explain how I understand the topic. And the topic is the following. Energy transitions, where are we? I should know because I am a professor, but I'm not sure I already know. There is a deep reason for that. When did start energy transition? I mean, all together at the world level. When did it start? Let's say at the Paris Agreement. We were around 200 countries together. And then we did say, okay, we understand, we have to do things together. So it did start 4 years ago. It's very young. How could we know the future of somebody, something made of humans being only 4 years old? And we have to imagine what this young human adventure will be when it will be 15 in 2030, or when will it be 35 in 2050. It did happen to me already once in my life, as you are going to see. I am 4 years old in the shop of my father. Nobody can predict what I will become, except at 15. Because at 15, I will still be the son of the butcher. So my future is the future of my father and not mine. But at 35, who knows? Nobody. And I think it is roughly the same with energy transitions. We see a little bit what it will be in 2030, but in 2050, we do not know. We have wishes, we have dreams or fears, but we cannot say that we know in the scientific meaning of knowing. But I will do with you an overview. And I will do because since 3 weeks in my school, we work on it. The results we will have only next year, next October. So after 3 weeks, we have only a small vision of the issue. And we did cut it into 5 pieces in accordance with Victor being there. Victor did suggest me 5 key issues. So the first one is really simple. What is an energy transition? Yeah, good question. What is an energy transition, by the way? Second, what are the costs and the benefits we expect from the coming energy transition, the one being 4 years old? Third, while some countries are encouraging it more than others, a good question too, because we have to do it together, but will we do it together? 4, what are the main challenges we can foresee in these energy transitions? You will see that I am adding a S by respect for the presidency in Argentina, not about the elections, that's the presidency itself, Argentina having been the country leading the G20 last year. And to conclude, what are the opportunities of energy transition for the citizens? On all of this, I will give you my own view. I do not know if I am right. I hope I am not wrong. I will know only next October in 2020. Let's go. What is an energy transition? We all know we are humans. We did start energy transitions millenniums ago. We did discover how to produce fire. We did discover how to domesticate animals, ox, donkey, camel, horse, llama. But I do not know if llama are used as an energy vector. We did discover how to domesticate the wind by sailing, by windmill, to domesticate rivers by river mills. So energy transition, we made already 10 or 20. What we would like to know better are the last energy transitions, the very big, very consequential ones. And a researcher from Canada did offer us such a vision a few years ago. He is saying that if we look across countries, we have very, very different results. Coal did provide more than 50% of the whole country energy. In England, 1620. France and US, 1870-80, which means 250 years later. And China, yesterday afternoon, because I was born already, 1960. So China did pop up 350 years after UK for the same energy mix. That's incredible, but that's true, that's facts, that's reality. If we look at the duration of this transition, in the slowest countries, it took up to 1 century to start using coal, to have coal as the first fuel. So it can be extremely long. Of course, we also have leapfrogging countries. There is a few. Japan took oil in 20 years, jumping from 6% to 72%. Netherlands did do the same for gas in 10 years, 1965, 75, I was there. I remember when the Dutch gas did arrive in my village. And Denmark did do it for wind in roughly 14 years, very recently. But Denmark is a small country and very windy. If we look at the entire world, it's extremely slow. To do world plus 20% for coal, to go from 5% to 25%, it took 35 years for coal, 40 years for oil, 60 years for gas. Very easy to understand. Oil and gas needs more specific assets, and gas needs a lot of assets, the gas pipes. So today, this energy transition says we will replace 4 times more. We will replace 80% of world energy, all fossil fuels, in how many years? 30 years? Will we do it? We'll see. In 30 years, I do not promise to come back in Lima, but my spirit will be with you, I'm sure. If we look at IEA World Energy Outlook, the one published last year, something is striking. This energy transition is government-driven. It's not driven by markets. It's not. And why government-driven? The reasoning of the IEA is the following. The reasoning is coming, but it's not there yet. But they say countries did sign for a long-term climate goal. It has been signed by the governments on the one hand. Of the other one, 70% of global energy investments, roughly $2,000 billion, are government-driven. So Fatih Birol concludes last year, the world's energy destiny lies with decision and policy made by governments. Do we agree? Is it true? Not sure. Because the fact that governments did sign, 200 governments, and that other governments are doing or framing the energy investment do not guarantee that the two sets of governments are the same and do not guarantee that the governments driving energy investment are also driving energy transition. And in fact, the same IEA report concludes that no, world countries globally will reach their cumulative Paris Pledge globally, but the Paris Pledge is not enough to trigger a world emissions peak, and the world 2 degrees centigrade warming is still out of reach. We won't make it. Even if we do Paris Agreement, we won't make it. So we have no guaranteed pathway, and the process we did decide together 4 years ago, 200 countries. The process is that the Paris pledges, what each country did tell voluntarily, will start in 2020 for implementation and ends in 2025. And this process has its first check in 2023. So officially, it is only in 2023 that someone will say, okay, we are doing it, we are not doing it. So we see that we know we are not on track and we have no other way to come on track. So it seems that this energy transition is started, but it won't reach its goal. And very interesting remarks by the Argentina presidency last year. Argentina was leading the G20, and the presidency did decide to publish its own vision, helped by IEA, but not asking the 19 other countries to vote on this vision. But this vision is very interesting because it's Argentina. Argentina is not a small country. It's a country with energy resources. And it's interesting to look at what they think. And I agree with most of it. And it's a quote. So I'm quoting what the Argentina presidency was willing to say. First, energy transitions with a S are driven by multiple goals. It can be modernizing and diversifying the economy, which is something else that what we spontaneously call energy transition, improving energy security by reducing import dependency and securing energy access. Third, improving air quality. And only fourth, mitigating climate change. So what the Argentinian presidency is saying is that okay, mitigating climate change is one of the 4 pillars, but there is 4 pillars. I'm sorry, there is not only one. And the next paragraph is very interesting also, because the national resources of G20's economy differ. Second, because GDP growth, per capita energy use, and per capita emission vary from country to country. The energy sources and technologies on which G20 energy system transition are based are highly diverse. In conclusion, these 3 paragraphs are really together. In conclusion, the pathways with the S chosen by individual G20 countries to transform their respective energy sectors are also reflected in the Paris Agreement, etc. So, it's very important to keep in mind that at the world level, we have what we can call an energy transition, but it is made of very different types of energy transitions, depending on the country, its particular set of conditions. There is no single world energy transition. There is many countries' energy transitions with many legitimacies. And the last question I can ask, Do we have any single word, energy transition economics? Can we agree at least on some economics of energy transition being the same everywhere? That's the second question being asked by Victor. Costs and benefits on energy transitions. But the Argentine presidency was just saying various goals, various technologies, various resources. It should end up with various costs and benefits. Easy to foresee. No doubt. But do we have something in common, like a world economic core, the climate economics itself? At least do we have climate economics being very robust? First of all, the total costs of world climate change are not measured yet. We only have predictions. We have numbers, but they are predictions. They are not measurements. What are these numbers saying, these predictions? But they are saying that given the size of the uncertainty of the effects of climate change, and given the size of the events linked to climate change, we do not know. We didn't face it ever, so how could we know exactly what will happen? We have some consensus of the type of events we see and we expect, we see and we foresee, because we do not expect. We see and we foresee catastrophes as drought and flood. We see already mass extinction of species, not necessarily linked to climate change, but in Western Europe, 2/3 of flying insects did disappear in the 30 past years, and 1/3 of the wild birds. So it's massive extinction, and the same in several North America states. Agriculture decline, which is a crop, is smaller and smaller. And there is some consensus on the shape of their costs of these catastrophes. That's a typical economic curve. It says that you see global temperature and you see climate damages. It says that it accelerates. The more global temperature increase we have, the more damages we have. This is accepted as a reasoning. After that, we have the numbers. You see 3 go with 3, 4 go with 4. It is coming from Nordhaus, having got the Nobel Prize last year. Its own vision is that we will lose 4% of the GDP for 4 degrees centigrade. He did calculate it based on local weather shocks. He did take weather shocks locally, and then he did extrapolate, and he did think, well, it should happen the same at the world level. And to compare it, the earthquake in Japan in 2011, you might remember, was 3% of the GDP. But when should we start topping this increase? Because this increase is accelerating at a point we should stop it. Nordhaus was saying at 3 degrees. And as you know, Paris Agreement is saying, no, not at 3, it's too late. At 2 degrees, it will be even better, 1.5. So you see that even if we agree on a curve, it doesn't say when to act and how boldly to act. Second, when will it be too late to act? Irreversible. The IPCC is saying 3 degrees, maybe 4 degrees, somewhere in between. So we should avoid going to 3 degrees because it can anytime become irreversible. So we will be deprived of action. And that's the basics of the economics of climate change. So it's a vision, but it's not a hard set of numbers. We can really easily build on it what to do. And even this has been strongly criticized by another Nobel laureate, Joe Stiglitz, and also by the Western Europe father of climate economics, Niklas Stern. And the core of the reasoning is that they say that Nordhaus is doing a theoretical reasoning, but with not enough relevant empirical basis. But when we go to empirical basis, what do we find? That's what I did do with my team. We are starting to do. We have a recent working paper from North America researchers, Kahn & Co. in August. It says that if we look at 174 countries and the way they did react on temperature increase from 1960 to 2014, so for more than 50 years, if we reproduce the same temperature increase in this 21st century, it should reduce GDP by 7% of the US, while if we were to implement Paris Agreement, it should limit the reduction of the GDP to 1%. That's one vision. But saying that in Canada, it could be 13% of the GDP reduction, and with other reasoning, which is letting the US do what they do with no other constraint or limits, the GDP could reduce by 10% as much as in Japan or in India. If we look at another research from the US again, published in Nature Climate Change and coming from many works done by the North America Agency for Protection of Environment, it has been published in April. They say that US, these days, let's say, is between going to 2.8 degrees centigrade warming to 4.5 degrees centigrade warming, and they calculate the consequences with several types of effects. You see health impact, how many people will die? Because we know that we have heat waves, many people die, old people, sometimes very young ones. They find for this $46 billion reduction of wealth. Loss of labor, because people are sick or cannot work, 75 billion, which you see, it's bigger than the health impact, which is mainly people dying. And both are the major costs. So they are not the costs we think spontaneously about. They are the humans themselves. Loss of coastal lands, 26 billion. Road damages, 12 billion. Flood, 4 billion. But there is nothing about agriculture. That's typical of climate economics. You have people being very good at doing something, and they do not know how to do the other things. And you, the reader, you have to live with this heterogeneity of reasoning and works. We also have something extremely interesting because the approach is totally different. It's the Global Commission on Adaptation. It has been created around Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, and he has been joined by many other people, like the CEO of the World Bank, Georgieva from Europe, and also the Gates Foundation. They did publish last month in September. What they do is a detailed cost and benefit analysis. They work on weather warning, infrastructures, dry land farming, mangrove protection, water management only. And they look at investment we can do to act in these 5 areas only. They find $1,800 billion investment at the world level could yield 7,100 billion, which is 8% world GDP. While, but I will give you some examples. It's very easy to understand. Knowing storms one day earlier can cut damages by 30% because we can protect. Using drought-resistant seeds have been seen increasing crop in Zimbabwe. Building climate-responsive infrastructures in towns can prevent flood damages. That's the way they think. So you see that here they are entering into practical climate economics. If we do this, we can get that. But they do not give a global number at the world level of all the damages and all the benefits. And now we are seeing point 3. I hope I will be on time. While some encourage more than others, this is spontaneously obvious. OECD did do the work from COP21 4 years ago. Average temperature change scenario. That's the world level. You see that in some point of the world, like half of Argentina and Chile, temperature will increase half a degree. But extreme, like in Asia or some part of Africa and Latin America, it will go over 3%. So we do not live in the same climate change at all at the world level. We have very different climate changes coming. And this is only temperature, but there is many other dimensions. Precipitations, how will we train in a year? You see that in some part of the world, reduction will be 1.6 millimeter a day. In other part of the world, we will have more 1.6 millimeter a day, which is a green dark. Even in Latin America, you see that some part of Latin America will have a deficit of rain, and other part of Latin America, we have so many rain that not obvious what to do with. And it seems that it is the case of Peru, so we should prepare your umbrella. Urban floods. Let's see. Exactly the same. You see that Soviet Union, North Africa, they have nothing to fear regarding urban floods, while India and China and Mongolia, they have to scratch their head because they will be number 1 in urban floods. And Latin America is not in a good position because you will see urban floods a lot, as much as North America. Sea level coastal threat, how much the sea will take on the land. You see the same. I know my picture is not so good. It's coming from my phone, not from my computer. But you see that in Asia, the number of countries being exposed are enormous. In Latin America, we have none. And we may say that in Africa, we have only one, Alexandria in Egypt. And in Russia, nothing. So we see how humans are so diversely exposed to this climate change. And this we knew from Argentina presidency already. The Argentina presidency was good at telling us, energy transition with an S. So climate changes with an S also. Now some politics, not politician politics. I'm a professor, I have my ideas, but I'm not good, I'm not a bold politician. But we can mix politics and geography in geopolitics. We all know geopolitics exists, of course. Peru is interested in Chile, of course. You are also interested in Venezuela, of course. But that's typical of geopolitics. Why Chile and Venezuela? Because they are there. While in Europe, we see it, but from far away. IRENA, in January, I was there in Abu Dhabi, did issue a new study, a new word, the geopolitics of energy transformation. They say it is a big shift as big as 2 centuries ago biomass to fossil fuel. It's an entire revolution, according to IRENA. And IRENA is an agency. IRENA is not driven by anyone. It's an agency like the United Nations. But why do they see it so big? First, relative position of the sets will move, will reverse. The fossil fuels rich will go down because fossil fuel will be worth nothing. Second, new energy leaders will emerge. China, we know. because they have renewable, and they have the industry for renewable, and they have the industry for electrical cars. It makes a lot. So number one of the winners is China. And India can also, I do not know if Mr. Pujarini is here, but we do hope in Europe that India will do things, because India has the potential to do exactly the same like the Chinese. Second, more diverse energy actors. Why? Renewables are better distributed all over the world, and each country dispersed everywhere. So it's a more decentralized energy. The ticket to increase renewable is small, 500 megawatts for wind, 500 kilowatts for wind, 1 kilo, half a kilo for solar. It's extremely small. And then it goes down to communities, municipalities, district, people thinking the same, cooperatives. It goes down to individuals. It goes down to off-grid. You are not connected to the grid, okay, but you will put some solar on your roof. And mini-grid, you can do with your neighbor. Even if the state does not do, you will do in your mini-grid. So this is an enormous change. Before that, we had only CCGT to have something of 300 megawatt, and before that it was nuclear, and nuclear is roughly in France 2 gigawatt. 2 gigawatt, 300 megawatt, 500 kilo, 1 kilo. You see the decentralization, it's enormous. As a result, all the world trade routes will change, all the trade flows will change, the fossil fuel rich will not buy anything anymore, and many new alliances will come to share loads. You can ally with your neighbor, to share infrastructures, to have connected power infrastructures, to exchange technologies, to discover technologies with your neighbors, or for the financing. So the change coming is enormous. The fact that we will have more diverse energy actors is much bigger than expected 1 week ago, because yesterday, IEA, International Energy Agency, did publish its forecasts for the 5 coming years. Revolution. PV, rooftop PV, is cheaper than retail electricity prices. Read it twice. Yesterday in Paris, IEA, it is cheaper. The red dot is giving electricity price. The blue dot, the price of rooftop PV in 2018, and in green in 2024. Everywhere, Germany, Japan, Australia, California, China, India, everywhere, the price of PV, rooftop, individual PV, is cheaper than retail price. It's a revolution acknowledged by IEA. It has been predicted by many others, but IEA is acknowledging for the first time, and IEA is saying, given these new costs of renewables, we can predict that in the 5 coming years, the amount of rooftop PV at the world level will go from 200 gigawatts to more than 500. It will be multiplied by 2.5 in 5 years only. But the potential is even bigger. The potential is 16 times bigger than what we will see in the 5 coming years. So it's an enormous revolution started at the individual level. My rooftop, your rooftop. Of course, we remember that we have many dimensions of energy transition. This we know from Presidency Argentina, and I will look with you at several, and I'm not sure I will have time for citizens, I'm sorry, but I have only 6 minutes. First, we can do energy transition by reducing fossil fuel emissions. We can increase efficiency of fossil fuel usage. We can substitute gas to coal, like in the US or Argentina. or Argentina helping by producing gas. We can decarbonize fossil fuel, but it's not done already. We can green electricity. The big advantage of green electricity is that the cost now helps to do it. This is the Lazard Investment Bank. It says that solar PV, utility scale, solar PV for big investments is cheaper than any fuel, any fossil fuel, gas combined cycle, coal, nuclear, gas peaking. The cheapest way of getting energy today is solar PV. That's why in Chile, in this desert, it's very interesting to see what they will do. This is IRENA. IRENA is the International Agency for Renewables. Of course, IRENA is in favor of renewables in the start. But IRENA, in May this year, detailed that next year, onshore wind and solar PV will both be less expensive than any fossil fuel alternative. Think the consequences on India. In India, renewables are cheaper than coal. I will do this one. After that, I will shift to citizens, to say something about citizens. The costs of renewables are given in a calculation called levelized cost of energy. And we have seen that these levelized cost of energy are now cheap. But what is the value of electricity produced by renewable? If you know electricity, the value is not the same at the peak and at night when everybody sleeps. So system value is as important as levelized cost. And we have seen that in North America. In Texas, last year, renewables were still 120% better than the average wholesale power cost. But in California, it was only 75 because California has already too much renewable. So renewable are not there when we need them. And this system value is a key component of the interest of the renewable. Second, as there are renewables, we need to balance them. We have to balance their variability. How will we balance it? How can we increase the system flexibility? With gas CCGT, gas peak, or with storage, or with demand response? All these answers are totally different one from the other. Third, we have to adapt the grids because we connect renewables mainly on the distribution grids, but they are not being conceived to receive generation. In Europe, we use fit and forget. We look at the peak and we build capacity to allow the peak to go well, but it's extremely expensive. Another way will be flexibility, which is to curtail 3% of the renewable at their peak, and therefore we have less grid. Or it can be done via markets with equilibrium shifted to real time. So instead of forecasting how the system will be balanced one day ago, we forecast 1 hour ago, 30 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago. But this we have to do. And then I will not do electrifying, I'm sorry. In 2 weeks' time, we will issue a report on electric vehicles in New Delhi, but I have no time. And I have no time to do the industry. I will skip all of this. I am sorry, I will skip hydrogen, I will skip all of that. I have no time. And I will only say a word. I have no time about financing. Financing green started. We have already $200 billion US green bonds a year, but I have no time. Opportunities for the citizen. First, the citizen may enjoy this energy transition like any other before. But this energy transition has something more than the last one, coal, oil, gas. What it is? Remember IRENA geopolitics. Renewables are distributed. New actors will emerge. Remember IEA forecast. Rooftop PV becomes irresistible. Today already, 1/4 of all Australians, 1.5 million Germans, many Indian farmers, and African villagers are benefiting from the distributed energy. And the way I'm seeing is that we have two enormous waves converging. Renewables are distributed resources with low entry size, low entry costs, plus digitalization of trade. Digitalization permits to activate retail size units, peer-to-peer trade. Me and you, we can trade electricity. It was a joke 5 years ago, it's not anymore. We may have organized platform, digital platform to trade. We may have blockchains, as Mexico is thinking for the farmers willing to sell their renewable to the market. Or we may have asset fleet managers. What does it mean, asset fleet managers? Electric vehicle. When we will have 1 million electric vehicles, they can be managed together by a software and a manager. Zero net consumption buildings. It's coming in California and in Europe. An entire building like this big one will become a small utility, producing, managing, storing, selling, buying. Mini grids for allotments. When you build new districts, new zones, you conceive the grid to go with. And IoT, Internet of Things, it seems a dream. It's not a dream anymore. It's coming in the 20 years ahead. All equipment will communicate via Internet and will be controllable via Internet. It's coming. All of this opens enormous opportunities. It is blocked. But they are jokes only. It's not consequential to be blocked on jokes, but it is blocked. What is coming? And what is coming in a sea of opportunity for citizens and community. Even me, I am a member of the Solar Cooperative in Paris, which is incredible. Huh? And we put the PV on the schools to have children seeing what is electricity. And I'm paying to have children seeing what is solar electricity. It's very slow. That's strange. I do not know why. Fasten your seatbelt. And now, in 2 weeks' time, my school is opening in New Delhi. We are very proud of it. We call it FSR Global. And we are asking Daniel, being there, to fasten his own seatbelt because we are going to India to do energy transition together. Thank you.
Gracias. Agradecemos mucho al profesor Glashant. Ha sido una exposición, en realidad ha sido una clase sobre la transición energética o las transiciones, como nos ha dicho el profesor, mencionando la propuesta de la presidencia argentina. Interesante también escuchar de esta revolución individual con los paneles solares en nuestros propios techos.